So there was a game developer article that came out. And it was titled Patch Notes Number 3: The Game Industry is Becoming an Innovation Wasteland. Astrobot acclaim, PlayStation 5 Pro disdain, and more jobs down the drain by Chris Kerr. So this article was just basically about the announcement of Sony's PlayStation 5 Pro and its like $700 price tag, which is honestly pretty insane. At that point, you might as well just buy a high-end laptop or a high-end computer and get something, just as good, if not better, and something that can also let you do work on it, stuff like that. And really, what they were saying in this whole press release and stuff is that like the graphics are, getting better and that they can run things at 60 FPS and all this other stuff. But I think the problem you're starting to run into is that a modern video game engine now could run 10 million polys on the screen, or 10 million tries. But the problem with that is, how does that look different than 5 million polys? It used to be when you doubled the number of polygons or tries and in the fidelity of a game, you could really tell the difference, right? Like think about games from the early '90s and like Quake and stuff like that versus like what was coming out in like the year 2000, 2002, and then like what Half-Life 2 was starting to look like, and then as you really start moving up, the Unreal Engine 3 games and like UDK and all that, there was a clear progression of the graphics getting kind of better and better, and the lighting model getting, in some ways, more realistic. But just this progression of graphics that's, I would say, at least for the last 10 years, has really started to taper off. Like there are definitely some differences. We are starting to see more ray tracing, some other stuff. The problem that we're seeing is that these incremental improvements or improvements in lighting models just aren't making games any different or any better. And I think kind of one of the symptoms of this too is that there's a lot of remakes and a lot of like games that rely on sort of ensemble casts of old characters. And these sorts of games are very much like playing into nostalgia, but with updated graphics or something, and it's just not actual innovation. It's not anything really new. And when you look at Sony themselves and their most recent game was sort of a high-profile failure of Concord, which went down in like 2 weeks, which I will admit I am still a little bit confused on. I don't know why you would release a game and then like pull it after 2 weeks when there wasn't anything that was like forcing you to. I mean, I know Cyberpunk got pulled from the PlayStation Store, but that was a situation where the game like actually just didn't work. Honestly, there is some inside baseball to that, where it's possible that project was just a leftover project from old management, and they wanted to just kind of get it out there and then, I don't know, kill it, get rid of it, do whatever they wanted. And I mean, I guess in one hand, like a Guardians of the Galaxy, Destiny sort of wannabe sort of game, I think was kind of an interesting idea, but I guess they just were not able to capture something. And we've sort of seen this like similar stagnation, for a long time. Many years ago, like I think we're talking like 5 or maybe even 10. We would talk about like the Ubisoft game, which was this concept of like this stealthy, shooty gameplay, and then there's like an open world. There's towers that reveal the maps, and there's all these like little side quests that are all a little bit different, but they're also like super repetitive. And it essentially became basic open world design. So sort of the problem that this was kind of coming out was that there was this massive influx of a reduction of risk in the games that people were making. They didn't want to innovate things because they didn't feel like a new product would actually sell. It was much easier to just put a bunch of engineering money into putting more polygons on the screen and then remaking an old game with those extra polygons and selling that again and making more money. I don't think that's the whole story, because there's also this element of risk aversion that's really just that games are too expensive to make now. And I know some people have talked about this, but I don't. I think some people are a little confused, or at least not looking at what I would consider probably the most important angle of this. I would say that the macroeconomics of the economy, especially the Western economies, are going to determine much more about how games get made than anything else. So when you look at some of the more popular games that have come out, they have been either Japanese games or they have been games from European countries, especially as a primary developer. Essentially, what this means is the AAA game space has been outsourced. I sort of consider the the outsourcing equation to be expertise divided by currency. So basically, you may not get people that are as experienced as the Western developers that have been doing this for 20 years, but in exchange of that, you can throw more people at the problem if the exchange rate and the currency is very favorable. So, like the Japanese yen right now is like basically worth less than a peso. I might have that wrong, but it's massively depressed as a currency. And when you think about it, if you're a Japanese company and you start selling your games and you start selling them in America, those are being bought with very strong American dollars. That's a ton of money coming into you. That's like could float your studio. Take like a moderate success, and then Japanese studio comes in and makes something, even if it's kind of a budget title or whatever. If it just makes 100,000 or 1 million sales, that could be enough money to really push you over the edge somewhere. Whereas, like in European countries, it's a little bit different because their currency isn't necessarily so weak. The euro is pretty strong as a currency, but they have a whole bunch of other little things they're doing on this side. They have a whole bunch of subsidies for video games being made in these countries. The government is giving money to these companies to run, and this is pretty common in most other countries. The United States doesn't do this very much, but most other countries, they will give you money to take on these sorts of like artistic, like prestige kind of projects, because the countries know that if they don't, throw a little money that way, those projects just aren't going to happen. So there's some subsidies happening, but also these countries have like way better benefits just through the whole like country. So it's like socialized medicine, better services, things like that, and it's just like all provided already. Instead of what you would have in the United States, where a lot of those things have to be purchased yourself. On top of that, they have these high personal taxes, which sounds like it would be like a terrible idea for people making games, but actually what ends up happening is that the wages are lower, but the companies find other ways to give kickbacks to people. They'll give them like a food stipend, or they'll give them like a company car, things like this to sort of incentivize people to work there. And because they can just not include that in their wages, it's like imagine if you had a car, but you didn't have to make a car payment on it. And yeah, technically your company owned the car. I mean, it would be a little annoying if you lost your job, but it would be fine if, that meant you could be putting all that money into savings or into something else. And then, just looking back at the United States, all of these problems are flipped around, right? The United States dollar in the last few years has been insanely strong. Video games are being made in the United States in the places that have the absolute highest cost of living. It's like just the absolute worst way of doing it. The other like real problem is that if you try to do video games in cheaper places, like if you try to go to, more economically viable places in the United States, now you don't have the talent pool. And then you might as well just outsource. You've essentially just outsourced inside the United States, which doesn't really make any sense because you can just outsource to another country, and you're essentially getting the same benefit, or more of a benefit because now you can take the currency exchange rates into account. There's really like no reason to make a video game in the United States. I would argue that like in the next 10 years, people aren't going to be making video games in the United States if the economic conditions do not change. There's going to be like a massive drain on the sort of representation of American culture in video games, because it's essentially going to become like either like a parody or like a caricature of what people who aren't from the United States think the United States is like. And I've already seen this in like other games, especially when like Ubisoft makes a game that takes place in the United States. It just feels really off. It's they don't understand what the United States is like. I think there will still be like certain kinds of games that still get made no matter where you are in the world. But what's really going on is that there's a certain kind of game that's not going to be made. It's going to be that AAA style of game. There's smaller indie devs. I think probably my favorite example of this is Spiderweb Software. But it's basically just a guy and his wife who've been, making like these games. Sometimes they do remakes, sometimes they make new games. But they've been doing this for like 30 years. And so obviously there is a way that, through hell and high water, that you can just keep making games and keep making money doing that. Surviving off a back catalog, surviving off other stuff. It does mean, making certain sacrifices somewhere. And I mean, the guy will freely admit that, the guy's not making AAA games, but he's making Spiderweb Software games. He's making games for a very specific audience that he's had. He's cultivated this community around his games. I think you're going to see much more of that being the viable model in the places that otherwise just can't make games, especially in the United States, where it's just too expensive. I know that was kind of doom and gloom. I will say this, so like everything I was talking about, the economics and all of these situations, in some ways the graphics and other stuff. All of these are paradigm shifts and economic indicators. All those things can shift. It's very possible for a company to come up and make their money on for instance, we saw mobile games become very popular. Those were not powered by graphics. Anyone will tell you that. We saw massive changes in how the economy was working in different countries and how that's been shifting. And we're just currently in a very strange spot right now. The worst bet would be to assume that the next 10 years are going to be the same as the last like 3 years we've had. So even though we've seen a massive exodus of people from the industry, just a lot of people kind of moving away from it, I think there's always sort of a fertile ground, especially as people leave. There'll still be a need and a want for people to make video games, even if it's not the most economically viable place to do it. And I'm just going to leave this off by saying if you are going into the video game industry to make money, you're probably making a bad decision and should go into banking instead. But if you want to go into the video game industry to make games, you're definitely doing the right thing.